Hello, and welcome to the Poison Paint Factory. My factory designated name is Poison 226. Nice to meet you. Long winding roads lead over hills you imagine to be green, but the reality is that they're the colour of ash. Leafless trees hang limply with long-fingered claws. They usher you on your journey or into their arms. There's not a soul to be seen as you roll into the cemetery. Under a skull-white sky, exhaust fumes billow, black plumes dancing on the breeze. The man you've come to see has long since gone. A ghost of him lingers, but you don't recall his face. The radio reanimates, but you shut it off. Last year's flowers die, only to be replaced. They're coming for you, Barbra.
Stop it. You're ignorant.
They're coming for you, Barbra.
Stop it. You're acting like a child.
They're coming for you. Look, there comes one of them now.
He'll hear you.
Here he comes now. I'm getting out of here.
Johnny!
Why is George A Romero thought of as the granddaddy of zombie movies? What's the deal with all the remakes and of the dead movies? And what if a zombie virus only turned men into zombies, leaving women unscathed and untainted? What would that film look like? Today, I want to talk about George A Romero, his Night of the Living Dead films, and why Barbra is so important to the movie. Disclaimer: a lot of the information presented in this video is public information that I researched alongside my interpretation and opinions. Sources will be linked in the description, and yes, there will be spoilers. Quick side note, from here on I'm going to refer to Night of the Living Dead as Night, because I'm lazy and I don't want to waste time saying 5 words when I can just say 1. Oh, and out of respect to Mr. Romero, I will not be referring to the dead as zombies. He may have called them many things, but never zombies. Therefore, I will not say that word after this point in the video, unless I forget and shuffle one in while you're not paying attention. So, with all that said, let's get to it. What's so important about Barbra's role in Night of the Living Dead? Okay, let's get introductions out of the way. Say hello to Barbra. This is 1960s Barbra. She's kind, affectionate and meek. She ranges from fearful and flighty to numb and back again. You could say she is the typical 1960s housewife, and she was portrayed by Judith O'Dea of the 1968 cult classic Night of the Living Dead. With only sporadic movie appearances elsewhere, Night will definitely be the only film you've seen her in. And this is 1990s Barbra. She is pretty much the antithesis of her 1960s counterpart, with her tough and headstrong characteristics. She is by no means a pushover, and she is a character who wants to be heard. While she may start off in the same vein as her namesake, and she does show fear initially, she is much quicker to grab the reins and steer away from madness much sooner in the film. I am doing her a disservice by saying this, but she is very much the typical action heroine, a strong female lead of the 90s. She'll kick your ass, and you'll like it. She is portrayed by Patricia Tallman, who was known for her stunt work and various appearances in Star Trek and Babylon 5. Both films start with siblings Johnny and Barbra driving to the cemetery to visit the grave of a parent. Johnny teases Barbra for being afraid, and then they get attacked by the first ghoul, which kills Johnny. Barbra flees and ends up in a farmhouse where she meets Ben, a fellow survivor. They fight off a couple of the dead, and soon after we are introduced to the other survivors, Tom and Judy, also known as Judy Rose in the remake, who are a young couple, and the Cooper family comprising of Karen, or Sarah, who is the daughter, Helen, the mother, and Harry, the father. The group soon argues about the best course of action for survival, but they settle on boarding the windows and adding extra protection to the house. A news report tells the survivors and the audience of the greater threat of the dead coming back to life. The group formulate a plan of escape by unlocking a fuel pump on the property and using it to fuel the cars that will take them to safety. The plan ultimately fails and Tom and Judy die. Harry betrays Ben, almost costing him his life, and the remaining group go back to hiding in the house and waiting, strengthening the defences best they can. The defences fail, more casualties. The farmhouse is discovered the next morning by a group of men who are hunting the dead and looking for the living. I won't spoil the specific endings here, we'll get to that later, but after the final scenes, some photos of the aftermath, and a news report actually wraps up the movies. Both movies are so much more than what happens in them, and to summarise them really is cruel. It's all about the interactions between the survivors and seeing how they personally deal with the dead man's hand they've been dealt, how they react to this unbelievable situation they've been cast into, and how they deal with that conflict. I couldn't recommend both films highly enough. In the original movie, Marilyn Eastman and Carl Hardman were the uncredited makeup artists who came up with some interesting and thrifty ways of creating gore. Now I know it was a different time, but remember, Night was premiered in theatres as a matinee in 1968, before the MPAA, the Motion Picture Association of America rating system, was created. So people of all ages could watch this movie. Not saying that Night was the reason, but only a month later the MPAA came into effect, so take that how you will. The way they achieved the decayed look of the stinkers in the movie was a mix of white foundation, darkened eyes, and chocolate syrup. Lots and lots of chocolate syrup. Looks about right in black and white anyway. But what about the wounds and injury detail, I hear you ask? Well, that was mortician's wax, and ham and entrails donated from a local butcher. It reminds me of the time they used real human skeletons in the 1982 Poltergeist movie. But I digress. Needless to say, why use fake gore when you can just use the real deal? By 1990, Tom Savini, who seems to be a regular on this channel for some reason, was already known as the King of Gore, so there were high expectations for special effects in the Night of the Living remake movie. This time Savini would be calling the shots from the director's chair in his directorial debut, but the team he had on board were equally capable. These people on the screen, under Savini's watchful eye, did some incredible work, and not a drop of chocolate syrup was harmed in the making of their film. The effects might have been more sophisticated, but they were actually quite reserved intentionally, as Savini wanted to be respectful to the original movie and not make a movie that's just a gore fest. It has its moments, like the shocking first dead boys the protagonist encountered, but overall I could see why people might have been disappointed when they saw Savini's name attached to the project and the more reserved gore that made it to the big screen. The original and the remake of Night both have merits, and neither outshadows or devalues the name from the other. They are very similar and at the same time very different. Let me explain. To get the obvious difference out of the way, Barbra is almost the polar opposite of herself in the two movies. The original Barbra, the one with two A's, is relentlessly teased and tormented by her brother Johnny, which she takes with little more than a whiny "Johnny." But she also comes across as caring and motherly. To summarise her, she is a very soft and plain Jane kind of character. The little conversation on the way to the cemetery really shows a snapshot of her life and who she is. It's a great introduction to this meek character. When they are attacked, she is easily spooked, and after seeing her brother beaten to death, she spirals into panic and later shock. The portrayal seems very genuine, but here is where the perceived problem lies. Modern audiences are used to heroes who are tough, strong, and just forge ahead. Well, our poor Barbra has a little bit of a stigma in recent years for being weak. and reductive to female rights and characterization. Some, myself included, would argue against these points to some extent, but we'll get to that. Barbra with 3 A's is a 90s heroine, and is almost unrecognisable to her counterpart after just the first 5 minutes, where she fights off a ghoul instead of relying on her brother to save her. She is still the same character in the beginning, but she very quickly steps into heroine territory. The transition is done quite well in my opinion. Over the length of the film, she trades her skirt for trousers, shoes for boots, removes her glasses and becomes Ripley-esque in attitude. She is hard, tough, she's an action hero. Again, this character has come under blast for trading her perceived femininity for stereotypical masculine traits in order to be seen as less pathetic. I'm not here to discuss the wider debate of what is masculine or feminine, but on a surface and stereotypical level, the 90s Barbra does fall under more traditionally perceived masculine traits, with a short page boy haircut, stomping boots and assertiveness, where original Barbra comes under more traditionally perceived feminine traits, with a neat petite dress, long hair and a historically used damsel in distress response to most adversity. They are different, but both are great characters in my opinion, and both ends of the spectrum of feminine and masculine traits can coexist, with neither extreme necessarily devaluing the opposite. In defense of meek Barbra with 2 A's, and being totally honest here, they would probably be my default response to any apocalypse situation. Now if you can say with 100% certainty that you would do otherwise, well, your nose might have grown a little bit. I think to internalise yourself after seeing your brother brutally killed is a fair response, and to go into shock and not be able to function is probably pretty realistic. Furthermore, when Ben takes charge, more on him later, a naturally passive person or someone suffering from shock would gladly remain in the backseat and allow a more headstrong person to take over the decision making, thus leaning into Barbra's character portrayal. In defense of badass Barbra with 3 A's, she is a more visually interesting character to follow, albeit at the potential detriment of Ben's character, who we will come to shortly. She has some fantastic moments, and I feel that this iteration of her character was created as a direct response to the negativity towards the original version of this character. There was no ill intent in the creation of New Barbra. In fact, I think they had nothing but good intentions when writing her, but maybe this is one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situations. At least this way, we have both versions of Barbra to enjoy, and if you feel strongly one way or the other, just pick the film that suits your taste. So let's compare Ben's characters. The original Ben was a big deal when Night came out. It was the post-civil rights era, and before this, films reflected the white-dominated world, where the main characters were nearly always white. People of colour were rarely cast in lead roles. When they were cast at all, they were often characters with stereotypical or demeaning roles. Ben's character was different. He was far from the blubbering fool stereotype that had been portrayed in cinema previously. He was smart, focused and a leader. He knew what to do and when. That said, it wasn't plain sailing for him either, as throughout the film he clashed heavily with Cooper. Maybe Cooper was racist, maybe not. Maybe he was just an a-hole who didn't like taking orders from anyone, regardless of race or gender. But this is what I love about the film. Nothing is spelled out overtly for you, but just hinted at. You can draw your own conclusions. Much like the 2 Barbra characters, meaning different things to different viewers. Throughout the film, it is clear that Cooper doesn't want to take orders from Ben and maintains his pig-headed stance that the basement is the safest option, even when Ben points out that it's a death trap. At the end of the film, wait, remember that huge spoiler I postponed earlier? Well, now it's back. In case you haven't seen the movies yet, and it is well worth watching, trust me, you may want to skip ahead or come back to this video after watching the films. Okay, so movie ending spoiler in 3, 2, 1. You've been warned. As day breaks at the end of the original movie, Ben is the lone survivor. He hears voices outside and cautiously goes to the window to look, but he's abruptly shot dead by the ghoul hunting posse. It can be argued that Ben obviously doesn't look or act like a ghoul in this moment, so his killing could be for bigoted reasons. Or it can be said that his killing was an honest mistake by someone who's a little on edge and trigger happy. After all, the world nearly ended, and they've been up killing ghouls all night without seeing another living person. If you want to know my thoughts, I'd personally believe that Ben's killing was on purpose, but either viewpoint doesn't really change the fact that no one survives the night. In the remake, Ben's fate is not quite the same, but we'll get to that. In the original, if Barbra was the daughter of the group, Ben would have been the father. He could be stern with her, but he seemed to care about her, even if he was influenced by the idea of survival in numbers. Ben has a large role in the original movie, and really is the driving force moving the plot along. In the remake, Ben is largely unchanged from his original counterpart, except that to allow Barbra to flourish and grow, some of the screen time is taken from Ben and given to Barbra instead. This is not a complaint, but it is something worth noting. In this instance, for someone to gain something, Barbra, someone had to lose something, Ben. Ben doesn't have to babysit Barbra, so that fatherly role is cut quite dramatically. Sometimes his pep talks seem to be more about helping convince himself rather than Barbra. This does give Ben the chance to display the conflict of fear and logic he may be struggling with, something which original Ben, by comparison, did not show. Speaking of new emotions, Ben and Barbra have a heated disagreement about what they should do. The outcome of whose plan they choose to follow could have drastically changed the outcome of the film. Whose house is it anyway? In the original, it is never specified who owns the farmhouse, which I always thought was a bit odd, but I guess it doesn't really matter when you know the world's going to shit. In the remake, a plaque with M. Celeste is seen on the side of the house in reference to the Mary Celeste. This was intentional by Savini, as the house is left in a state akin to the ghost ship of the same name. In the film universe, according to Tom, it's his Uncle Regus's house. Finally, let's compare the group's survival plans and the endings in more detail. One of the focal points of the original movie was that Ben thought that the house was safer if strengthened properly, whereas Harry believed the basement was safest. Both are right and wrong in their own ways, but in the original, after the ghouls break into the house, Ben is left as the lone survivor by, ironically, holding out in the basement. In the remake, the ghouls get inside and Ben still ends up in the basement, but only after he's mortally wounded. Harry is also still alive and ends up in the attic. Both men are trying to hide from the ghouls. Hiding in the house or the basement were always the two survival options, but with the remake there was a third option that was never acknowledged in the original. Why not simply walk around the shambling undead? Barbra mentions this many times, but Ben and Cooper both agree that holding out is best. So Barbra's plan is never followed. That is until the end of the remake, when Harry flees to the attic and Ben is wounded. He encourages Barbra to leave the ghoul-infested farmhouse and walk to safety. Since the two movies have two different outcomes to the survival plans, they both have different ending scenes too. In the original, as we said before, Ben survives but is shot regardless. In the remake, Ben actually dies and comes back as a ghoul before being shot. Harry survives but is shot regardless. In the original, it is assumed that Barbra dies when Johnny returns as a ghoul and drags her outside. But if you follow the timeline in the comic Empire of the Dead, Barbra actually survives. Since we're comparing the movies though, for now we will go with the timeline where Barbra dies. The remake differs because Barbra survives on screen. After escaping the farmhouse, she meets the ghoul hunting group who take her to safety. When Barbra wakes up the next day to what can only be described as a bit of a circus, we see the degradation of man as they fight ghouls with their fists and string them up in trees, using them as target practice. This ending scene was written for the original, however the scene with ghouls hanging from trees was cut due to racial tensions at the time of the movie's release. The scene being revived for the remake also serves to link it better with the next film, Dawn of the Dead, where survivors become more tribal and barbaric. This carnival of horrors at the end of the Night film would be a message to the audience. This will be the new normal. Quick shout out to Bill Moseley, who played Johnny in the remake. You probably know him for his role as Otis in the Rob Zombie movie House of a Thousand Corpses and its subsequent films. Tony Todd, who played Ben in the remake, was also the Candyman in the movie of the same name. There are many different versions of the original Of the Dead movies made by Romero. The first movie he made in the series was Night of the Living Dead in 1968, which was then recoloured multiple times over the years. The first being 1986 by HELL.O Studios, which featured ghouls with pale green skin. Another, in 1997 from Anchor Bay Entertainment, had grey-skinned ghouls. In 2004, Legend Films produced a new colorised version where the colorising was much better, but the film quality is less sharp. In 2009, Legend Films co-produced a colorised 3D version of the film with Passmore Lab. According to Legend Films, Night of the Living Dead is the first entirely live-action 2D film to be converted to 3D. Starting in 2015 and releasing in 2018, the Museum of Modern Art and the Film Foundation used the original camera negatives and audio track elements to create a 4K digital restoration of Night of the Living Dead. In the original movie timeline, Romero's Night of the Living Dead was followed by Dawn of the Dead, 1978, Day of the Dead, 1985, Land of the Dead, 2005, Diary of the Dead, 2007, and finally Survival of the Dead, 2009. Only Night, Dawn and Day had official or true remakes. There are many more movies, remakes and other stuff within Romero's IP that I would love to talk about, but it's such a vast web of information with remake, reboot, do-over, inspired by prequel sequels, that not even Charlie could get it to make any sense. And so, without further ado, I present to you, in the only way I know how, all the relevant information I could find relating to the franchise and legacy of George A. Romero's Of the Dead works. Romero was known for using his films as a tool to tell stories based on social commentary. Whilst these themes appear clearer in some films than others, and there's still room for debate on what the main focus or allegory is, if you feel so inclined and have time, I'd recommend watching all these films with these themes in mind and see what you make of it. Romero's set of films are worth watching, even if you're not necessarily a fan of ghouls and zombies, but can still stand to watch them. Of course, I wouldn't encourage you to watch these films if you do struggle with visual horror. In my opinion, after re-watching all these films for this video, I would say the strongest themes and social commentaries in each film are Night, racism, Dawn, consumerism, Day, collective military mindset and revolution, Land, classism, Diary, media influence and social profiteering from the internet's mass communication, Survival, decaying of family dynamics. What if a ghoul virus only targeted Y chromosomes? Only men would be able to be turned. So, how would a Romero movie handle this concept? Well, I believe he would use this idea as a starting point for more social commentary, just like his other movies. This movie would be centred on the difference in gender roles and societal expectations. Depending on what period the movie was set, it would drastically change the commentary, as well as the plot of the movie itself. But let's say it was to follow on from Night of the Living Dead. That would place it sometime in the 1970s. There were new economical freedoms for women, social progressive ideas from the 60s were still in the public mind, and there had been great technological advances at this time. So, with this in mind, let's embrace the Empire of the Dead timeline and say that the original Barbra survived Night of the Living Dead. As ghoul hunters rounded up and killed as many infected as they could, the virus, like most viruses, adapted in order to survive. The virus mutated to zero in on people with the Y chromosome. The old viral strain that was capable of affecting women would eventually die out, taking the female ghouls with it. This is the platform I believe the film would start from. During the film, the ghouls could now represent the unwanted advances or violence of men towards women, and the invasion of their bodies. Typical zombie movies now often try to save someone from the infection through amputation. Indeed, this was tackled in the original Day of the Dead. But in this hypothetical film, whilst the virus may not function without a Y chromosome in the traditional create-a-ghoul sense of the word, bites and scratches from ghouls can still cause regular but dangerous infections if untreated. To amputate or not could become a contentious part of the movie, with those having the Y chromosomes passing commentary on what those without Y chromosomes should do when presented with this choice. In the real world, bodily autonomy was a hot topic in the early 1970s as the women's movement was on a roll. But by 1977, the National Women's Conference, which was meant to create unity, turned into a battleground between two distinct groups. It would therefore be easy for the battle between the ghouls and Y and non-Y humans to be an allegory for this real-life issue. Obviously, I have no political, social or historic qualifications, and my own opinions and theories are just that. My own. I don't want to get too heavy with discussing my ideas for the social or political themes a hypothetical movie might have, because I think Romero would just insinuate these topics anyway, and leave it to the audience to hypothesize. But I think this could be something to start conversation around these difficult topics, which might raise awareness and help bring about positive change in the future. Let's summarise this video and let you good people continue with your day, shall we? Well, we've talked a lot about how similar and different both Night of the Living Dead movies are, how important the characters are to the movies, and how great and flawed they all are, for better or worse. We've covered a little about sexism and racism, and how what can be acceptable at some point in history can be insensitive at another. How absolutely crazy the legacy of one movie can be, with insane ripple effects on a form of media. And how you can sneak social commentary into the most unlikely places. Oh, and while you're here, why don't you tell me in the comments how this video and the last video are linked? Resident Evil compared to Night of the Living Dead. And so, with all that said, thank you for your time. I wish you a good day and many more besides. Yours, Forever in Horror, 226.
Yeah, they're dead. They're all messed up.